This might be a strange way to start a talk, and particularly a talk at a church on a Sunday morning, but I think the Bible has some very, very strange commands in it. Some of them are written to specific people, so we don't have to kind of follow them. The prophet Ezekiel, for example, did you know he was told to lie on one side for 390 days and then turn around and lie on his right for 40 days? Joshua famously was told to walk around a city that he wanted to invade, but just march around it before blowing some trumpets. But there are things that Jesus says that apply to us as well. He says, for example, that if someone strikes you on one cheek, you're to turn and offer them another. It's an old command. He tells you if your eyes or your hands cause you to sin, you're to gouge them out and cut them off. And if we want to follow Jesus, then we have to think carefully about what these things might mean for us. But the instruction I want to talk about this morning is slightly different, but I think it is equally strange. Others have pointed it out, and that is the instruction to sing. When you think about it for a moment, if you were God, if you were writing the Bible, you were inspiring people, you were trying to explain how your creation, you and I, were to live on this world in a way that brought glory to God, yes, but was kind of mutual flourishing and seeing justice done, what would you write? What would you tell us? How would you tell us to live? Because I bet you could probably get on board with do not murder. You think, yeah, I think I would write that one. Or do not steal. I think I could write that one. Work hard, be faithful to your wife, but sing. Do not murder and sing. Do not steal and sing. It's weird, isn't it, that 50 different times in the Bible, Christians, those who follow Jesus, are told to sing. What does all of this have to do with the Exodus story, you may be asking? Well, we're at the point in the story where, as we saw last week, the Israelites who have been in Egypt for 400 years are now free. They were living as slaves, most recently under the rule of a tyrannical pharaoh who killed them, who killed their children, who worked them to the bone. They are now free. And we read at the end of last week's story this amazing moment when the Israelites go through the Red Sea and the waves come crashing down on the Egyptian armies. We read Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. It's a dramatic moment. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Put yourself in Israel's shoes now. What would you do next? Maybe you'd make a little bit more progress just in case someone else was going to come and attack. Maybe you'd think, gosh, there's only a desert in front of us. We need to start planning. Very next chapter, the very first verse. The Moses and the Israelites sang. Why on earth would they sing? Why do we? If you've been a Christian say you became a Christian when you were 20 and you're now 50 and you've been to church once a week, my estimate is that you've probably sang for something like 50,000 minutes. And it's not just like a 21st century thing. The Christians have always been famous for singing. There was a writer called Pliny. He was a Roman who was commissioned to try and shut down the church. And when he wrote in about 110 AD, he spoke of this distinctive feature of Christian communities that they would gather together to sing. So why do we do it? Why does God tell us to sing? I want to look at a few reasons this morning. And the first one is this. I think singing is a natural response to good news. And you might not think it's a natural response to good news, but bear with me and come with me to Twickenham Stadium 8 days ago. Now, I know some of you are South African fans and you know where this story is going to go, but you're the best ranked team in the world, you've won the World Cup, so I think we can just enjoy this moment for a minute. Back to the sermon. England are 2 points behind with 1 minute to go, and England get a penalty. That's worth 3 points. Step up Marcus Smith. 22-year-old fly half who slots the ball in the middle of the posts and gives England a famous victory. Imagine yourself standing in the crowd, the hubbub rising, the cross of St. George is flying around you, and then just around you start hearing that noise. Swing low, sweet chariot. Tens become hundreds, become thousands, become tens of thousands, coming forth to carry me home. It would look a little bit weird if you wrote that down on paper and told someone to do it, but I've been at Twickenham once or twice, mainly when England have lost, but I've been there, and it does feel pretty natural. Imagine instead that it's New Year's Eve. The time is 11:58. You've had a wonderful dinner, you've drunk some drinks, you've played some games, you've danced some dances, and the clock strikes 12, and you gather round together in a circle, you cross arms, and you start singing, "Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind?" You then have that slightly panicky moment that happens in our house every year when you realize that no one knows the next two lines of the song. And this is acknowledgeably a weird, a slightly strange tradition, especially for those of you that might not have grown up with British New Year's. You might think, what on earth are they doing? But you fear not, because you're getting to the chorus, the bit that everyone knows. We'll take a cup of kindness yet for the sake of auld lang syne. The other thing that's slightly weird about this is I don't know anyone who knows what those words mean. But still, we do it anyway, and in the moment, it feels natural. In the face of good news, often it seems like the right thing to do is to sing birthdays, weddings, New Year's. And Moses and the Israelites have just had the most wonderful good news. They've just been set free. Only in the recent years, their children had been murdered. They'd been worked to the bone. They had absolutely no hope. And now they're out of Egypt, facing some very good news indeed. And so they sing. They say, "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both the horse and the driver he hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his armies he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone." The song says that the horse and the driver have been thrown into the sea. That is both the agent and the instrument of their oppression for the last 400 years. They've both been defeated, and so there's no way back. And they start singing. It's like that moment when the Twickenham song starts rising. It's maybe like the football team in a coach on the way home, or maybe the medieval army that have just won a victory, and they're sitting around a fire at night, and they're drinking a beer, and they're singing a victory song. Singing often feels like the right response to good news. And Jesus' brother James, when he writes to Christians, says, "Is anyone happy? Then let them sing songs of praise." There's an early Christian leader called Paul who wrote many of the letters we find in the New Testament, and he often speaks about this Exodus story when he speaks about the victory that Jesus won for all those that would follow him. He says that many of us were like the Israelite slaves. We weren't slaves to Egyptians, but maybe slaves to money or to power or sex or addictions or depression, things that we couldn't escape from, ultimately slaves to death, knowing that one day we would die. But he says Jesus at the cross won this great victory for all those who trust in him so that they can be free, so they can experience eternal life. We, like the Israelites, have gone through the waters of the Red Sea as we were baptized, and we now stand on the other side of that, free from our past, looking forward to this great future. Paul says he's leading them. Jesus leads us now in a triumphal procession. And in so many of his letters, he speaks about that victory. One of them is a letter to a church in Colossae. He says, he has rescued you from the dominion of darkness and brought you into the kingdom of the Son he loves. And in this letter, he then explains all sorts of things that Christians are to do in light of the great victory that Jesus has won. And some of them are expected, but this is the one that we're speaking about this morning. He says, "Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts." Paul says one of the responses to the wonderful news that all of those who place their trust in Jesus are now free and have a glorious future ahead of them is to sing to God with gratitude in our hearts. I don't think it's just a natural response, though. I think singing makes us feel good. Go with me. I know some of you won't be convinced yet. In Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus, he gives them a really similar instruction to the one in Colossians, but not in the context you might expect. He says this: "Don't get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord." I don't know if you would have made the link between drinking wine and singing songs, but Paul seems to say there's a sense in which the joy and the pleasure that we can find in a bottle of wine can also be found as the Spirit fills us and as we sing songs. In fact, this is supported by quite a lot of recent science. Like, at the end of the day, a bottle of wine can often make us feel good, but studies show that singing, and in particular group singing, reduce anxiety, they promote well-being. Singing releases endorphins that are associated with feelings of pleasure. Singing releases oxytocin, which alleviates stress. It promotes trust and well-being. And you might be thinking, well, that might be true if you sing like Dave and Dave sang this morning, but you haven't heard me sing. It would not release any stress in your life whatsoever. Well, I've got some good news. I was looking this morning and found this from a talk by Matt Chandler, who's a pastor in America. This is from the Psychology of Music study in 2005. You'll be pleased to hear that singing can produce satisfying and therapeutic sensations, even when the sound produced by the vocal instrument is of mediocre quality. I'm not looking at anyone in particular, but I think we're okay. As with all of the things that God asks us to do, he asks us to do them because he knows us. He knows what's good for us. He knows how our body works. Yeah, the things he asks us to do are for his glory, but they're for our good, for the good of those around us. And he tells us to sing. He tells us to sing together because it brings us joy. A third reason why I think we sing is that singing is a means to remember. The letter to the Colossian church said, "Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another." It says, as we're singing, the message of Jesus Christ is dwelling within our hearts. The things that we sing are the things that we remember. On the way home last night, I was in London last night, and on the way home we were playing some throwback tunes that were maybe 15, 20, 25 years old. And the people sitting in the car with me, and I won't embarrass them and mention that one of the songs was S Club 7, but we're knowing every single word of that song off by heart. And I want to try an experiment this morning. And there's going to be a little bit of participation, so I'm giving you, fair 10 seconds warning. And I'm not going to ask you to sing, don't worry. You can sing if you want, but you don't have to. But I want to see how many songs you can remember. We're going to start with a simple one. I want you to see if you can finish what I start. Okay, so Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Very good, very good. Quite an easy one. Let's go a little bit harder. Let's try this. Ready? Doe, a deer, a female deer, Ray, me, call myself far, a long, long way to run. So, a needle pulling thread, la, a note to follow. So, tea, a drink with jam and bread, that will bring us back to dough. Well done, round of applause, well done. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever studied that song or read the words on a page or set out to really try and remember it, but you all know it. Well, at least some of you know it. We're going to try one more. This one's a bit more risky. It's a little more highbrow, classical literature. Let's see if any of you can remember this. If you do know it, I might need some help. It goes like this. In West Philadelphia, I was born and raised. In the playground is where I spent most of my days. Chilling out, maxing, relaxing. Okay, we'll cut it there. We'll cut it there. You get the point. We sing, we remember what we sing, or in some cases, what we rap. It's why we know, I think, hundreds, if not thousands of songs in our mind. It's why someone who has Alzheimer's might not remember their name, but can be moved by music. I think it's why Paul tells us to let the message of Christ dwell in our hearts as we sing. And because we remember what we sing, it's really important what we sing. There was a group of new Christians in the Arab Peninsula that were recording a piece of worship music, and it was going to be the first piece of worship music recorded in their language, and there was an English translator with them. They were not far from an Al-Qaeda base, so this was real kind of underground church, and they were recording this song, and he heard what they were saying and noticed it was theologically obscure. And in the moment, you can think of all sorts of reasons why he would just let that happen and let the music go. But he said, no, we've got to stop. And he spent hours reworking the words with them, yes, keeping the same kind of cultural dialects and rhyming and music, but making sure the theology was super clear. Because this is so important. This is the first thing that you are going to write. It's going to shape your theology for years to come. It's important what we sing. What does Moses' song teach us about God? Let's read on, verse 6. Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood up like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy boasted, I will pursue. I will overtake. I will divide the spoils. I will gorge myself on them. I will draw my sword, and my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in mighty waters. Sing this song a few times as the Israelites are wandering through the desert. I think it will remind them of an important truth. Did you notice when they were speaking about the Egyptians, it was, I'll do this, I'll do that, I'm going to be victorious, aren't I the best? The Israelites on the other side of the Red Sea just give glory to God. God, you have done this. You have saved us. This is nothing to do with me. This is not because I had a good plan. It's not because I'm a better person, not because I could work it out, not because I could make my way through the Red Sea, but God, you have saved us. And that shapes them as they're walking through the deserts for the next 20, 30, 40 years, and things aren't going right because they're remembering, I'm not here because of anything that I've done. I'm not here because I've worked it out, and I'm now worried that I might have forgotten or I might have lost my way. But I'm here because, God, you did this. And that's important for us to remember too. We're not here, we're not saved, we're not those who follow Jesus if you do because you have done anything particularly spectacular. In fact, you haven't done anything spectacular. The only qualification is that you've recognized that you don't have it all together and that God has saved us. And so when things are difficult, we don't worry about, maybe I've got myself in a muddle again, but we lean on God. Remember, God, you've done this. You're going to save us. You're going to guide us through. And we know we learn those things in song. Famous song, from life's first cry to final breath, it's Jesus who commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ, I'll stand. Moses' song continues. He says, you stretch out your right hand and the earth swallows your enemies. And then this important line, in your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling. The people of Egypt at the time, in fact, the people of the entire world would have probably been quite comfortable with a God who was powerful, a God who was vengeful, a God who was mighty. The plagues would have probably not bothered them that much at all. This song, though, speaks of a God who loves. That's a distinctive feature of Yahweh, of the God that led the people out of Egypt. It is a distinctive feature of the Christian God today that fundamentally is identified as a God who loves. And songs like this are an important way that we remember the full truth about who God is that we find in the Bible, because we live in a world where so many different things will be vying for our attention and shaping us in different ways. It might be the films we watch, the shows we watch, the music we listen to, conversations we have with friends. All sorts of things are vying for our attention and molding us into a certain way, and a certain way of thinking, and a group of things that we might want, a vision for what the good life is like. And in the midst of that world, with so many things vying for our attention, we need something just as strong that takes the words of God, the full words of God, everything that we find in the Bible, the full revelation of God in Jesus Christ, and roots it deep into our souls and into our minds. And I think singing does that. For example, I might want to teach you, or might think it's really important because it is, to know what's going to happen when Jesus returns. That glorious day when Jesus comes back and he remakes the heavens and the earth. And one of the ways that we could learn that is that we could teach it, or I could encourage you maybe to read some books or listen to a podcast, and those would all be really good things. But there's something about singing. There's something about gathering together week after week saying, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we'll have no less days to sing your praise than when it first began. When we sing week after week after week, as we gather together, that shapes us, takes hold of something deep in our minds and in our spirits that changes the way that we live. That's why we encourage you to come week after week and join us as we sing and as we worship. It's not just because we want lots of bums on seats. It's not just because I want to speak to lots of people. Because we want to see lives transformed. We want to see people living in the fullness of everything that Jesus has for them. And one of the main ways we do that is by singing together and establishing these truths deep in our hearts. A couple more reasons we sing. We sing through trial. When the early Christian leader Paul, who we've spoken about already, was traveling in Philippi with Silas, they come across this fortune teller. We can read about it in the book of Acts. And she's making a huge amount of money for the people that own her. And she follows Jesus, and she decides not to do it anymore. And the owners are furious. And so they drag Paul and Silas, they bring them in front of the magistrates, and they have them stripped and beaten and thrown into prison and fastened in the stocks. Roll forward a few hours to midnight. What are they doing? They're singing. Singing encourages us through trials. And it doesn't just encourage ourselves, it encourages each other. You might have noticed in those verses we read earlier that Paul says, speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs. Teach and admonish one another with songs from the Spirit. And I can imagine the Israelites walking through the desert, and for those of you that know the story, the next 40, 50 years are pretty difficult for them, but as they sing this song time after time, the Lord is my strength, He is my salvation, it encourages them. Some of you will know Gemma Lee Brown. She died almost 2 years ago now, but I will always remember so well spending a night worshipping with her in the little church just outside the hospice where she spent her final few days. I remember there was maybe 40, 50 of us there. Some of you would have been there. And we were playing, and she was right in front of me in a wheelchair, and we sang, and though I walk the darkest path, I will not fear the evil one, for you are with me. Your rod and staff are the comfort that I need to know. It's words straight from Psalm 23, and it encouraged my soul. And I know from speaking to Gemma Lee, it did her as well. As we sing, we encourage ourselves, we encourage those around us. But we also encourage all who would wish to listen. The psalmist writes, give praise to God and proclaim His name. Make known among the nations what He has done. Sing to Him, sing praise to Him, tell of all His wonderful acts. I think it's why the author, Pastor Tim Keller, who some of you will know, says that good corporate worship will naturally be evangelistic, by which he means when we come together and we sing songs about Jesus, if we do that well, it will naturally be a way by which this wonderful news about Jesus is known to anyone who will hear it. As I was preparing for this morning, I heard this wonderful story about a man called Dimitri. He was a believer, he followed Jesus, and he was imprisoned for that. He spent 17 years in a prison with 1,500 hardened criminals. His tormentors were never able to break him, and when he was asked why, what is the source of your strength, he explained that every morning he would get up, he would stand at the end of his bed, he would turn and face east, he would raise his arms, and he would sing songs to Jesus in his own dialect. And the reaction from the other prisoners was, as you may well expect, they were mocking and jeering, trying to quieten him. They would get their metal cups and they would bang them on the rails. They would sometimes throw food waste. They'd sometimes even throw human waste at him. But every morning for 17 years, he would sing. Then it got to the day when he was to be executed, and they took him out of his cell, and the guards walked him along the corridor towards the courtyard where it was to take place. But before he got there, 1,500 hardened criminals stood up. They went to the edge of their beds, they turned east, they raised their arms, and they sang the songs that Dimitri had been singing for the last 17 years. And the jailers turned around to him and they let go in terror, and they said, "Who are you?" Dimitri said, "I am a son of the living God. Jesus Christ is his name." Soon after, Dimitri was released to his family, and he lived to tell this story. In the face of difficulty, all kinds of difficulties, singing encourages us, it encourages our friends, and it's a means by which anyone who wishes to hear, anyone with ears to hear, can hear the wonderful news about who Jesus is. Finally, singing is a means, a way by which we can look forward. At the end of Moses' song, he looks forward to what God is still going to do. He says, "You will bring them in and plant them." He's speaking about the people of Israel. "You'll bring them in and you'll plant them on the mountain of your inheritance. The place, Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, Lord, your hands have established." See, God still has work to do with these people. Here's a promised land before them, a place that he's prepared for them. And Moses looks forward to what God is one day going to do. And as we sing songs together, we can do exactly the same thing. Jesus is coming back one day. He's going to remake this world. A new heaven and a new earth will be joined together. There'll be no more sadness, no more tears. And we can look ahead to that day and singing, oh, when the saints go marching in. When the saints go marching in, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in. Soon and very soon, we are going to see the King. When he returns with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone and faultless stand before the throne. All of these things shape us for the wonderful future that's to come. We're approaching Christmas, aren't we? I think it's, someone will know, 26, 27 days, something like that. And the China Harvest Mission tells a story of believers living in North Korea. And every Christmas they would gather as darkness fell, and they would quietly slip out into the night and walk up the mountains, and they would look out onto South Korea, and they would think about their brothers and sisters who could go to church freely that evening, who could gather in their homes and sing carols without fear of death. And they would gather and they would sing, not Christmas carols, but they would sing faith of our fathers, living still in spite of dungeon, fire and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whenever we hear that glorious word. I love this. Something about these brave men and women following Jesus who are still, despite everything, singing about the great joy that they can find in their hearts as they look out and they think of brothers and sisters in South Korea and all over the world who one day they will get to sing with. Hundreds of millions have been doing it this morning in sports halls, in stadiums, in beautiful buildings, in blacked-out basements, in hotel rooms. Hundreds of millions from all nations have been gathering together to sing, and that doesn't just teach us about what's going to happen in the future, but it's also a taste of what's going to happen in the future. It's a taste of the moment we read about in the book of Revelation, when we read that a great multitude that no one can number from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, are going to stand before the throne and before the Lamb, that's Jesus. They're going to be clothed in white robes. They're going to have palm branches in their hand. This is rich biblical imagery, but they're going to stand before God and they're going to sing, salvation belongs to our God and to the Lamb, Jesus. I want to encourage the band to come back on stage. We are going to sing in just a moment. Thank you. On the night before he died, Jesus sang. He sang with his disciples. And then as he hung upon the cross of Rome, he quoted from a well-known song. It starts like this. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's the first line of Psalm 22. As Jesus goes to the cross, he gave up his life for your sake and for mine. He took upon himself the consequences of everything wrong that we had ever done. He paid our debt. And as he did that, he felt for the first time totally alone. So he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? But that song goes on. He says, all my bones are on display. It says, people stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments. But you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. And God does. 3 days later, Jesus is raised from the dead. And as he does so, it proves not only that the debt that we owe and the consequences that we were due to face have been totally taken by him, but it proves that death has been defeated. The horse and the rider have been thrown into the sea. The agent and the means of everything that ultimately could hold us back and could cause us to die have been defeated. Jesus is victorious, and so we can look together forward to the future we have with him. And as we celebrate that wonderful news, we sing. Doesn't mean that things aren't sometimes going to be difficult. For those of you that know the rest of the story, the Israelites had another 40-odd years wandering through the desert, facing all sorts of challenges. But it does mean that we know what the end will be. We know the end of the story in the moment Jesus returns, when we know the fullness of the kingdom of God. Every good and perfect thing God has will be established on the earth. So I want to encourage you to sing this morning. For some of you, that'll be easy. You might be really good at singing. You might feel God really closely. You might not be going through anything particularly, and singing might be fine. For others of you, that won't be the case. But I want to encourage you to sing all the same, to build, encourage one another, to remember the truths of what God has done, and to look forward to the wonderful future we have ahead of us. Should we stand together? I'm going to hand over to the band to lead us in song.
You're like a circle that floats around me, keeping me safe and sound. And when I fall, you've tied a rope to me. You're blessing me every day.